To have Professor Rajiv Bankers at IIMA. I think some of you know his name for DEA BCC model, but that's a very small part of Professor Banker, I must say. He is currently the MARPS chair and director of the Center for Accounting and Management Information Technology at the Fox School of Business. Professor Banker is internationally recognized as a leader in interdisciplinary research in management. He has received numerous awards. In fact, if I keep on counting, seeing his CV, it will take me for 10 minutes to cite his achievements, what he has done. So he has published over around 200 articles in top journals, which includes Management Science, Accounting Review, Journal of Accounting and Economics, and ends with Econometric. Okay, so you can see the list of publications what he has. I think he is recognized by the Institute for Scientific Information as one of the only 243 most highly cited researchers in economics and business worldwide that have made fundamental contribution to the advancement of science and technology. So with this little introduction, I will hand over to Professor Banker for his talk today on cost management research. So again, Professor Banker, it is a real pleasure for us to have you here. And before you start, a small memento from IIMA. I would like to hand it over. I mean, most of the times it is at the end.
Yeah, exactly.
I would want to do it at the beginning. And this is a small memento from all of us. Thank you. Please, the floor is yours.
So you are assuming that my talk will be worthwhile.
Okay.
But thanks for inviting me here. Actually, as it turns out, this is the very first time that I'm presenting a research seminar at IIM Ahmedabad. Even though I've known this place even while it was being built. So I go back that far as well. And I used to be visiting as a child to Ahmedabad every winter. So I'm very accustomed to and enamored with the weather we have in Ahmedabad at this time of the year. But I can't say the same about May or April. But nonetheless, it is indeed a great pleasure to be at IIM Ahmedabad finally. I should though point out that I am one of the founding faculty at the Indian School of Business as well. So I've been quite closely involved with the Indian scene for the last several years. I do wear multiple hats. So thanks to Abhiman, I think many of you know my work in DEA. And I was just explaining to Rajiv that it happened virtually on the very first day I started in the doctoral program at Harvard, because Bill Cooper, who was the founder and had moved to Harvard, and he was my advisor as well. Because my undergraduate work was in mathematics and economics, and then I had qualified in India as a chartered accountant and a cost accountant, and I still didn't have a good idea about business, except what you get as a CA doing articles, which isn't all that much. I was chosen specially to work with Bill Cooper. For those of you who might have heard of him, he was in fact one of the major founders, not just of DEA, but operations research and linear programming modeling. He had the classic book on that subject. And at the same time, he was a senior chair professor in accounting and also a member of the Hall of Fame of accounting. So my combination was just exactly right for him. And for me, it was a great experience. On the very first day that I got there, I had to go and sit in his seminar. And he had invited his student at Carnegie Mellon University, Eduardo Rhodes, who wrote the dissertation that had the CCR model in DEA, for those who know about it. And I got onto it immediately, somehow related to it at a very intuitive level, and pointed out a few problems with that model. Actually had, you probably don't know this, but a big battle with Abraham Chance, who was a very famous mathematician, about the returns to scale issue. And he didn't believe me at first when I pointed out that the CCR model required constant returns to scale. But eventually I was able to convince him. This is for, I guess, any faculty on this side? No, not on this side, right? Yeah, so you guys are, outcasts. What do you have to do to get promoted to that side? You don't.
They can just come over.
That sounded like a big threat. No, I don't know why. It happens in all places I visit. Somehow, PhD students that, oh, you're moving. By the end of the seminar, you might make it. But nonetheless, so Bill Cooper's advice to me there is, when I got, this is as a PhD student, into the battle with one of the most famous mathematicians in the world at that time, Chance. He said, you are a big boy, so fight your battles. And that's so true, that in academia, you got to have the confidence that what you're doing is right and is important, and then you should have the confidence in yourself to stand by your work as well. Because if you're not persistent, it will not go anywhere. The normal reaction is, any new ideas need to be shot down, which should not be the case. Unfortunately, that's the mindset that you see, not just in academia, you see it all around in the world. But that's where, again, do good work and then be persistent in selling it as well. And DEA has grown so big now, it's amazing. All around the world, thousands of people working on it, and also in as far as practice is concerned too. Which is the other thing that I learned from my advisor, that instead of just working on a problem that has been documented in the literature, in the research literature, try to bring in some new problems. Understand what's going on in the business world and try to model that and describe that. That is what is harder, but a lot more rewarding. First, I find a lot greater pleasure out of it when I'm doing it myself. And if you are enjoying what you're doing, you're going to do much better work. And if you're doing work that is relatively new, where you are bringing in new problems, introducing the literature to new business problems, you're going to have a lot of citations. And I've always enjoyed having thousands of citations to my work as well. So, that's the kind of reward that you get in academia that you should strive for. Again, it's really your mindset that matters more than anything else, because what I've found over the years is most people who get their doctorate are bright. Intelligence is not what is lacking. The difference is the fire in the belly. Do you really want it? And are you willing to work for it? Those that have it are typically the ones who succeed in academia and who leave a mark in academia. So, remember this 10 years later, once you have lit that fire in your belly, and you have had great success that I had told you about. So I go around the world preaching these new ideas in a variety of subjects. I wear many different hats, and that's again because instead of following one theme from the research literature, I try to follow whatever is exciting and whatever new problems are facing the businesses and for that matter public policy issues as well. I was just giving an example to the director D'Souza. A few years ago I got invited by a consulting firm on an assignment that they were doing for the Emirates and the different Emirates and some of the other smaller countries in the Middle East. All these dictators or kingly leaders, they were all spending on information technology, but the fight amongst each of them was who was doing a better job, whose people were more happy. So even though there is no democracy, they do care about the happiness of the people because that's what gives them stability of their regime. And so I got into the question of national happiness. And interestingly, new measures are available for that as well. Unfortunately, for this consulting assignment, the Arab Spring intervened, if you recall, and that scared these sheiks out, and they didn't want to do anything on happiness for a few years. So my project got abandoned, but I got exposed to the data that was available, and that's massive amount of data that allows you to understand what drives the happiness of citizens. And I've been involved with Bob Kaplan. You might have heard of him in the context of balanced scorecard. And even activity-based costing for those who are in that area. But I was involved with the balanced scorecard as a result. He has been my co-author for a while, even before it was given that name. So what I've developed now is a balanced scorecard for nations, where instead of delivering shareholder value, you want to deliver happiness for citizens. And have a full cause-effect model that starts with the natural resources. Like in India, it would be the demographics, people and education. In the Arab countries, it would be the natural resources, and so on. But then how the various systems and processes and going into the questions of the typologies in public finance that allow for ways to explain how those resources get converted eventually into greater happiness. Very interesting insights that I was able to estimate by pooling data over a number of years for many countries, because this national happiness measure is now quite widely available as well. And I'm doing something similar now in China. Interesting, the dictatorial regimes do care about their citizens' happiness, and so they are also interested in looking at the happiness of citizens in their major metropolitan areas. So, just an example of how new ideas, new assignments can enable you to think independently and bring that into the literature. This is still new and under review, but it will be something that hopefully will leave a mark for future use. And that's what I urge you to be aware of and thinking. All right? One other thing, feel free to interrupt me at any time. If you have any comment or questions, I'll be most delighted to take your questions.
I have a question, if I may, right at the beginning, since you spoke about happiness. Did you find that happiness across territories to the people means the same? In the word happiness, does it imply the same characteristics intrinsically to different populations?
A good question. And interestingly, therefore, the measure of happiness doesn't include the word happiness at all. So what has been done is a detailed survey instrument which looks at various aspects of life.
But even those aspects, would they be the same from population to population?
That has been validated by social scientists. So this is a very widely used term.
Does that make it correct?
No, it doesn't. I mean, you can question that as well. So your point's well taken to the extent that I would say the dependent variable that we are using is not happiness, but this worldwide measure of happiness.
In a way, you were then acting upon the population with your friend.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
In your inquiry, you are acting upon the population with a friend that you have.
The frame I'm using to explain the variations in this measure.
Explaining comes much later, but first to understand. Even to understand, you are using a frame that.
No, that I'm not the first one. I mean, there are hundreds of people.
Whoever may be the first one, but if it's just a development of a frame and the evolution of a frame,
right.
We are talking about a frame being used.
Yeah.
So to understand and then to explain.
Yeah. So this is still relatively new, but I suspect what you might be concerned about will be true soon, as this measure becomes much even more broadly accepted. Because government policies are now being based on this measure.
That doesn't change the problem. You see, there are many things that are found useful by all kinds of people. Usefulness is never an attribute of knowledge itself. It's an attribute of the users. So I'm more concerned about the knowledge itself. How do you determine that the frame that you have used is one that the people themselves would consider appropriate?
Let me turn this around a little bit. This has been validated, and the usual ways of validation are consistency.
There's only one way of validating, which is to keep using your frame.
No. This is for survey instruments. No, whether there is consistency across different evaluators. So this is cross evaluator consistency, often measured by a Cronbach's alpha. That's been done. It's been validated in terms of, is this correlated with constructs that we usually associate with it? No, that's been done. Let me give you another, which a scale measure that I have developed is for measuring strategy. I was talking to some of the people here in strategy. Usually the way we measure, say even Porter's generic strategy framework is very ad hoc, and every researcher does his own survey of CEOs. There have been some that have tried to relate it to a realized strategy measure based on financial numbers. But those are all one-time measures, and you don't have the consistency across the measures. So what I have, the PhD student of mine, we have developed is a textual analytical measure. In the US, in the annual 10K reports, management is required to provide a summary of the business and how they feel about it. There is a similar thing required in India as well. So if somebody here is interested in doing this in India, I would be quite interested in talking to you. But so what the textual analysis is basically counts number of keywords. So we have to come up with the keywords, but the keywords we draw from are those that are used in the research literature. the way we validate it is, consistency. Strategy is a long-term notion. This is something that remains stable over the years. Strategy is associated with certain differences in performance, certain differences in the activities. There have been some results about strategy that have been documented using private measures of strategy in the literature. Do they get reproduced with a textual measure? And it does. So those are the different ways in which in social sciences we use measures for constructs that have been measured, not measured, or measured in a different way in the past. Having said all that, that fundamental question you must always be aware of, namely, no, you are simply measuring it, and that's not the same thing as somehow directly observing what that phenomena is, right? So, and the danger, for instance, of the classic fable of blind men touching the elephant, right? Depends on what part you look at, and you will get different insights. So, one of the part of the validation is it broad-based enough to describe the various phenomena that have been associated. But to come to this, I've already sort of talked about a couple of things, happiness and also in strategy. I dabble in a lot of different areas and wear a lot of different hats. So DEA, as I said, I got introduced the first day in my doctoral program. I was at Carnegie Mellon University for a very long time, and as a result, I got very deeply into information technology, and I've also been the editor at Management Science for information technology, and I was founding faculty at ISB, starting the technology area at ISB as well. Although I don't do all that much work now. So that's another area. I work in the operations management area quite a lot because that interacts with all these different themes. And I was one of the editors at MSOM, Manufacturing and Service Operations Management as well. So the basic point being that it's really a lot of fun to juggle all these different balls. Unfortunately, it doesn't reproduce it, but this is an animation, and there's a juggling going on, and invariably, of course, he drops a ball. So that's a danger, but no, the trade-off is it's more fun as well while it goes. Today, we decided deliberately not to talk about DEA model, so apologize if it disappoints some of you. But I think if you know about it, then you probably already know quite a lot about DEA. Instead, what I'm going to talk about is a little more in the cost management area. It is exactly about a year since I got my Lifetime Achievement Award for in the management accounting area, and so this speech is based on that acceptance speech for the Lifetime Award there, and that's because again been involved in making some fundamental changes and asking questions that get at the root of what we teach in management accounting. Let me ask just a quick check. I don't expect too many, but how many of you have taught management accounting? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you have studied management accounting? How come you haven't studied management accounting?
My areas are economics,
so economists don't need to know that.
no, but
Right? You look down at accounting. Now, this is interesting because a lot of the work that I've done sort of blends those two, and there is tremendous opportunity in arbitraging across the different disciplines. And one of the things, so if you learn management accounting, very likely in the first 2 weeks or so, you will have been introduced to cost behavior. The idea that you have something like a fixed cost and something like a variable cost. Does that ring a bell? And those who teach it, teach that to their students as well. Have you ever asked, how do you know that that is correct? How do you know that costs behave like fixed cost and variable cost? Even though it might make intuitive sense, that doesn't make it correct. Do we have any evidence to support it? And the reality is no. There isn't. And that's why I began looking at it, also empirically, to ask that question. And what we find is that what we were taught and what we teach is false. This is something at the very foundation of a management accounting course. It is in the textbooks, all the standard textbooks, but it is false, empirically not true. Now, there are extreme cases when it would be, but what we have therefore also developed is a theory of cost behavior. But a key idea that I want to kind of plant in your minds is, because this applies in applications all across the board, is that costs don't arise automatically. No, there is no endowed property given by God that makes certain costs fixed and certain costs variable. In fact, the reality is that in any business, it is the managers who have to make decisions about the resources that they're going to deploy at any particular point in time. Those resources might be the machinery, the materials that they consume, and also the labor that they. And as far as labor is concerned, managers have to make decisions to employ more workers or to get rid of workers. So labor costs, you might be taught, direct labor costs, are they fixed or variable? You sure? Oh, you're the accountant. It's got to be right. It's interesting. So I teach executive programs all over the world, and when I teach in the US or Canada or in China, they are equally quick as you are to say that those labor costs, direct labor costs, are indeed variable. So you would be right in China. But when I teach in Germany or France or Spain, they are also equally quick to say that direct labor is a fixed cost. Why? They don't read the same textbooks? Yeah?
Even in India, there's a situation.
Yeah, exactly. It is. Why? What's the difference?
There's a trade union and there is
Yeah, exactly. And labor laws. And in Western Europe, the labor laws are very supportive of labor, which make it extremely difficult for management to get rid of a worker who has been hired. And as a result, going back, the managers are very careful in also adding more workers. And so what is the consequence? They learn to manage with a fixed number of workers, just as we learn to work with a fixed amount of machinery in the reasonably short term. And in that sense, labor becomes a fixed resource there. So both answers are correct. But what we got to go is underneath there as to what drives it. And so what we have done in this theory is to open up that box. Costs don't get that behavior automatically. They result from what managers can do with it. And as a consequence, in some countries, the same resource may be fixed or it could be in another country variable. Even in the same country. Think about it, like let's say USA. Would a worker in a fast food place like McDonald's, will that be a variable cost or fixed cost? Compared to, say, a worker in a high-tech plant where expertise and experience comes along. Where would it be fixed and where would it be variable? Yeah, exactly. Right? Does it make sense? So what's different? What's different is what you learn in economics, which is the switching cost, the changing cost, cost of transition. Because there is a cost involved in laying off workers. There is a cost in even recruiting new workers and training them, and the period when their productivity is lower. So there is a lot of cost in the transitioning in the level. Adjustment cost is the term we use, adjusting the level of resource. But managers have to make that decision. The managers have to make that trade-off. And so what is very intuitive here is if the adjustment cost is high, like in say Western European country, you can, or in a high-tech plant, you will be quite reluctant to adjust the level and treat it more like a fixed resource. But if the adjustment cost is low, like in a McDonald's worker, you will be more likely to take that as a variable cost. Make sense? And think about it like so for machinery. Why is that a fixed cost? Because once you install the machinery, you can't just take it out at low cost. Why is materials a variable cost? Because if you don't use it, you can always inventory it at a relatively low cost and use it in the next period. Interesting, but that provides a logic as to thinking about what's fixed and variable cost. So now when I teach management accounting, whether to senior executives or to undergraduates, instead of telling them that some costs, some particular costs are fixed or variable, I provide the logic. And they relate immediately at high and low levels of their experience because the logic is what is pervasive. And that's something that I would urge you to be thinking about. Don't just take something as given because everybody says so. Ask the question as to why. Yes.
So what I didn't get is why you said the theory is kind of false, because all you are saying...
No, not theory, assertions.
And all you are saying is the categorization can be a bit fuzzy, which I totally agree with.
Which one?
It can be a bit fuzzy. The same input can be classified as one group versus another.
Yeah. And that's the weakness of the theory. Right? The weakness of the classical classifications.
No, that is what I agree that it's an assertion that people will say that labor cost is always variable cost, but that is not.
I did cost accounting, so I actually got the gold medal there.
Okay.
And I say that not so much to boast about it, but that I have some authority here. There was a big controversy in the ICWA where people were debating is direct labor fixed or variable. And this exact same arguments. So this has been around for a long time. But what we're trying to do is to systematize it. The test of a good theory is not just explaining old phenomena, but does it also help us explain something new that people have not looked at, and I'll get to that in just a moment. I'm basically setting the stage for these papers, but opportunities for research in management accounting. And there's a stream of work that's going on here. And the most exciting part is that by understanding these fundamental ideas in management accounting, it provides some very important insights about financial accounting and in finance in terms of how we can interpret the returns data, for instance, in the stock markets. So again, it kind of spans across a whole lot of different areas as well. So coming back again, the most important innovation that I see here is that it is something about the process that leads to a behavior. The behavior is not automatic. The behavior is a consequence of the cause, is a consequence of management's decision. Somebody is making a decision. So once you admit that, then you can introduce the new ideas. What drives that decision? Right? So we have opened up the box. It used to be a black box. It happened automatically. And that's the difference. Now we say that this is a consequence of decisions made by managers. Opening up that box, we can look for what drives it, what are the determinants of that. And at the basic level, the trade-off is when sales might go down, you might want to cut back resources like, say, labor to save that because they won't be needed against the adjustment cost of laying them off, and in case the sales rebound in the next period, the cost of ramping back up again. Clear? Now that itself provides a basis. This is, in econometrics, you would often see this as an endogeneity problem. I see this as an endogeneity opportunity. This is very interesting. I learned this in China and Korea. That they have a word for crisis. What image comes to mind when you think of a crisis? A threat, right? The crisis. And so they have two characters in the word crisis. The first character is threat. But there is a second character which means opportunity. Every crisis may shake up the incumbents, but may also create opportunities for newcomers, new ideas, new ways of doing things, and changes the competitive layout of industries as well. And that's an opportunity, and most people find it more difficult to conceive of the opportunities that a crisis may enable. And I do technology, so often encounter that issue. Same thing here. So the endogeneity is, that the cost behavior, we said, open up the black box. It's not something that is exogenously given. It's an endogenous choice of the managers. And so you've got to now consider, a secondary equation that kind of captures that decision. Right? That's the way we usually deal with it in econometrics. But think about it. That itself is something interesting, because what that gives us is an opportunity to infer from the observed decision of the managers what they must be perceiving, or what they must be thinking, or what they must be observing. Let me ask a basic question. If you are very optimistic about your present condition, and you believe that this decline in sales is only a short-term phenomenon, transient, and in the next period you are surely going to be rebounding back to increase increasing sales. Are you more likely or less likely to keep your labor even though it may be slack this period with the sales having gone down? Will you keep it at the same level, or are you more likely to cut it back? Does that make sense? So what does that mean? If you are more optimistic as a manager, you are more likely to preserve those resources. It's interesting because what does that tell you? By observing now what we call the stickiness of cost, to what extent do the costs remain there even if sales have gone down, you can infer that the managers must be perceiving a good prospect for the future. Does that make sense? No, so it is very interesting. This is all information available in the public domain, and it's generally not being used as such. It is which is to derive some better understanding about the business itself. And so, how should stock markets behave when you find that a company has sustained the labor into the current period, even though sales went down? The typical thing is to keep the labor. That's an expense, so the earnings will go down, and that's a bad signal, and the markets react negatively. But if you think about it the way I do, that if they have maintained and have sticky costs, that's actually a signal of good news for the managers, because they expect the sales to rebound and share prices should be reflecting the expectations about the future, and therefore it should be treated as good news and not bad news. So again, interesting and a very different sort of a perspective. And my response earlier, as you develop the theory, it's not just explaining what has been looked at, but also providing new insights. And that's something that we've been pushing quite a lot. And in fact, what we're finding is that many of these old models are not adequate. Let me just give you one quick touch there. This is for the DEA measure. And so what happens to the DEA measure that you are using to evaluate efficiency period to period? The efficiency is going to be lower when the costs are sticky. But that's not necessarily bad news. In fact, it would be good news. And that's interesting. In terms of using the DEA efficiency measure as a measure of something inherent in the organization that would persist over time, and you may use it to predict the future performance of the organization. It may actually go contrary to the way it has normally been done. And that's, in fact, something we have already documented. You've been waiting.
Sir, can you reflect on the P by E measure? I mean, the earlier cases that you talked about, the crisis thing, where the stickiness of cost you were
So
talking
what measure?
P by E measure. P by
Price
E,
to earnings.
price to equity.
Oh,
Price per earnings.
price to earnings. Okay.
So, at that point of time, would the company would be able to regain its earlier position? Can the P by E measure is a good reflection? I mean, can you reflect on that? The stickiness of cost you talked about, there the earning per share actually is coming down. If the company is
No, it's interesting. Because remember, price depends on how the investors respond to that information. if the investors and in fact the financial analysts are efficient in interpreting the information correctly, you get a different price than you would if they are not able to do so. And so to answer your question, you would first need to understand how the analysts and investors respond to the sticky costs. And that's something that we have done at quite some length. So I'm going to hold up the long answer. Hopefully I'll have the time to touch upon it. And we do have some very interesting insights on that. But the short answer would be that the naive way in which the PE ratio is used is wrong. Right? Again, if I say naive, clearly it's wrong. But again, you've got to be much more sophisticated in understanding not just the price, but even the components of earnings, and not just in a surface perspective. You've got to be comparing the costs, expenses relative to sales, over time periods as well, and understanding the reasons why as well. So there is a literature in accounting, it's called fundamental analysis, which basically looks at ratios of all one of those ratios is each expense to sales. And the idea there is if your expense to sales ratio goes up, that's a signal of inefficiency. Like again in DEA, where we do it in a multifaceted perspective. And so in DEA also we would say that's inefficient. And so the theory there then is that market will penalize the company. If they see expense to sales ratio go up, they perceive greater inefficiency, they expect the inefficiency to persist over time, and therefore projecting into the future cash flows, they would say that the cash flows will not be as strong, and that's why the price gets bid down. Clear? But we challenge them, and it's very interesting. The fundamental analysis has long been actually used by analysts and investors. So it's easy to see the answer to this. The analysts and investors, we find, rely still on fundamental analysis, and they interpret the increase in the expense to sales ratio as a negative, and therefore they bid down the price. But our theory is just the opposite, which is that it can provide good news if you understand it correctly. It's not quite as simple as simply looking at there's other information that needs to be used as well. But that can be very interesting because it allows you to go contrary to what analysts and investors are doing. And in fact, what we show is that you can form investment portfolios based on this that yield a substantial return as well, which on the face of it may go contrary to the efficient market hypothesis in finance, but it's not quite as simple as that either. Hopefully I'll get a chance. What we find interestingly, I'll just kind of give you a little bit here now, is the markets don't respond correctly to such events, but they make adjustments drip by drip every quarter at the time of the quarterly earnings announcements that lasts for more than 8 quarters when the market eventually catches up with the original information that came about. And that's interesting. So our portfolios make money for 8 quarters, which is fairly substantial and quite long. It's a sort of a delayed effect. Market takes its time. Okay, there is another. That's all of the economics you want? Not enough economics for you? No, no, I'm just kidding. There's another connection to DEA and in accounting and finance. A new measure has been introduced in these literatures, and a first article in the management science, but also later in accounting review and Journal of Financial Economics, so top journals. What they are doing is to measure the DEA efficiency across companies and using that efficiency measure as a starting point, and then they regress the DEA efficiency on a whole lot of other observables about the company and about the management, and the residual is what they label as managerial ability. Because in a lot of corporate finance, managerial ability is an important construct. And this is being used quite a lot in corporate finance applications, where they essentially use, and the person who's led this is, his name is Baruch Lev at New York University. He's an interesting personality with multiple facets, kind of a guy that I admire. So he's introduced this, his first foray into
You referred to this person from...
Oh, I admit, this measure has not been validated.
There is another measure that's been validated, which is the measure of managerial productivity. In fact, it was validated by Manaka and me long back, way back in 1990. Is there any relationship between that measure and this new
You'll have
measure?
to educate me on this. I'm not
It's
familiar.
called managerial productivity.
Okay.
And it's been...
How do they measure?
It's measured by looking at how knowledge is created in an organization.
Right. So
And
this
there's
is actually
actually-
arguing the same. In a
And so
sense.
that's been done already. So I'm wondering whether you are reinventing the wheel or whether there is any new nuance to the managerial productivity.
Can we talk after that?
Sure.
Because I'd like to learn more.
But what's the name of this guy who is reinventing the wheel? Baruch what?
LEV.
LEV.
Well, we'll have to still confirm whether it's the same thing. So one of the ways that they claim to validate their ability measure is that this is something that would be firm specific and would be persistent over time, and therefore it would predict future performance as well. So they use DA efficiency measure to predict future performance. In a sense, that's what they're doing. They're doing other corporate finance applications as well with this. But what we do find is that there is a systematic pattern in their ability measure, because when sales go down, there are firms that are keeping the costs, sticky costs, and if they do so, the DEA efficiency is going to be lower, and therefore it suddenly appears that managers' ability went down in those periods when sales went down. And so that's again the obvious flaw, and so we have to make adjustments for that understanding in both DEA as well as in the ability score. But in forecasting performance for the future, using this idea of ability, if we refine it using this idea of stickiness and information that it reveals from observed behavior, it actually is a better predictor of future performance. So interesting possibilities as you kind of combine all these different literatures as well. Okay.
But this measure, so what you're talking about is very noisy. How will you differentiate between a manager who is acting on some optimistic behavior and some who is incompetent. So who is not able to see what is happening and one who has some superior information.
Right, that just makes it more difficult to find the association, right? So in your econometrics course, you would have learned that the t-stats are going to be low because of variance, unexplained variance is going to be larger. And that's a knock against finding anything using this measure. So no doubt it's a noisy measure. But as they say, that in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed is the king, right? So while this is not a perfect measure, they find that they validate it using the notions that were prevalent in corporate finance and accounting, and they use that to argue that this is not a bad measure, right? But definitely not a perfect measure. But if you got your hands wet doing empirical work, you know that there is nothing that's perfect. All right. I'm still on the first slide, but I thought it's much more interesting to have the right intuition and background. And by the way, don't let anyone undermine the importance of intuition. Intuition is extremely important in research, and try to develop your intuitive side as well. What intuition is in fact the residue there are a lot of ideas that you have learned, and they should be spinning around in your brain. And in your subconscious, that's what you need to train your subconscious to do, is to put those together. And that is what becomes intuition. We say that people with a lot of experience have better intuition. It's just that their experience has helped them get these random thoughts together in something meaningful. And that's where you get the big breakthroughs as well. And I found intuition is extremely valuable in my own research. And not just empirical research, where I can see patterns that my co-authors cannot and others cannot, because that's the way I've trained myself to think. But it is even more important in my theoretical work, where I do mathematical modeling. It's even more important because I've seen people who simply do just hard labor, mechanically kind of going through the mathematics. It is a lot easier to develop much better mathematical models if you know the vision at the end of the tunnel. Where you know intuitively that this result has to be true, and then I have a much better way to develop my mathematical models. And some of my DEA models I have developed in that fashion. So again, don't undervalue the importance of that. All right. So it is an exciting time actually to be in management accounting, and in part because by its very nature. So it's good nobody here is teaching management accounting, but they've had financial accountants in many schools teach even managerial accounting to their students, and students complain that there is no reality in financial accounting. At least you get annual reports to look at, and that's because those that they have to people who teach it don't do anything real or relevant with management accounting. If you do so, it's a tremendously exciting thing to do. And by the way, I have converted a number of people with PhDs in economics or operations research into teachers of management accounting. And it's actually much better economics because you might have heard accounting pays a lot better than an economics PhD. So make that transition while you can. It's a lot more rewarding. Some famous people, so like my own advisor, Bill Cooper, he never got a PhD because he disagreed with his advisor. And he said, to hell with you. And he proved himself. But those were, old times. Don't try it today. You won't get anywhere. But he did, even though he started in accounting, he did his work in operations research. Bob Kaplan is very famous accountant, and is very highly cited by both academics and practice. But his PhD also was in operations research. And he was hired at Carnegie Mellon, actually by Bill Cooper. And the day he arrived to start his job, there was no need for an OR teacher. So Cooper gave him a textbook in accounting and said, this is your assignment. You're going to be asked to teach accounting. So Bob had to teach himself accounting and then teach the students. And it works, I've done it too. As long as you are 1 week ahead of your students, it's all right. But take up such challenges. It really grows you, it expands you. And there is no better way to learn a subject than having to teach it. Right? Particularly good students, because you don't want to embarrass yourself in front of those good students. But anyway, that's just an aside. This is a tremendously relevant area. And so one of the things that I love doing is beating up people. Asking these basic questions. I already asked you this question. And it's published in the top journal in accounting because we were able to document how the severity of labor laws in fact determine the fixity or variability of labor costs across all OECD countries. Very powerful result, but again, look for the right kind of data. One other thing, just chatting with Abhiman yesterday, in our business, if you're doing empirical work, it is usually very hard to start with theory and derive hypotheses and then go searching for a data set to test that hypothesis. And many of you might be at that stage or coming to that stage. What I found much better is to identify interesting sources of data and then relate it to theory to ask the question, what hypotheses what questions can I answer in a persuasive fashion, given the data that I have? Because if I determine the questions first, usually the data is not going to be enough. And for referees and readers, it will be easy to tear you down because it didn't perfectly match your hypothesis question. But if I go the other way, that this is the data that I have, this is what I have to work with, now can I formulate my question in such a way that it can be fully answered with my data? It's a subtle but important art. Learn that. Then you will get a lot more papers published as well, because you will be able to then go around the usual criticism of referees, whose job it is to point out that you might have said that this is a question you're going to answer, but your data didn't really let you do that. Right? So keep that in mind as well. So some basic things are questionable. There is no evidence, and we are working on this. This is a paper that is again interesting to a broader audience. including in operations management. It got the best research paper in the last 5 years award, which is sort of the highest award that you get in accounting for your research papers. It asks this basic question. In a business that is facing a greater amount of uncertainty in the demand function, are they likely to have high fixed cost and low variable cost, or low fixed cost and high variable? Or there is no relation between demand uncertainty and the cost structure? Don't think too deeply, just ask. No. Why? Why should it have low fixed cost?
So the demand uncertainty is high. This implies if you have high fixed cost, there is high chance of mismatch and more probability of losses being made. And but if you have high variable cost, then anyway if the demand goes up, you can
Right. In fact, this is a huge consulting practice, where pretty much all the top consulting firms are into this business. They call it variabilization, which is essentially they help you convert your fixed cost into variable cost, with the idea that in case the demand goes down, the variable cost you can move down. Often that entails outsourcing, and that's sort of with the it sort of explains the advent of outsourcing as well. Right? Yeah.
But why are we not looking at this way that if my company has a high fixed cost, then in uncertain demand condition, I can get away with this fixed cost by selling it.
Selling what?
Selling fixed cost. Fixed
How do you
cost.
sell the fixed cost?
With fixed cost, I'm assuming the capital, the
No,
fixed assets or
it could be
machinery.
it could be machinery. So how do you sell your machinery? But it could be labor as well, right? We've discussed.
In fact, it could actually mean that it's much lesser price than what you would have got in a better environment.
Yeah. And of course, if you have, installed your machinery and you're going to dismantle it, it's like a used car. You're going to, lose a lot. And so it's not that easy to sell your fixed cost.
So in case of the variable cost as well, if the demand is uncertain, there is a low demand condition, and
so if you are outsourcing, just to be clear, what do? You stop outsource, stop that order with your outsourcing. That's easy to do. And in fact, that's the appeal, that if the demand goes down, it is easy to cut back on such variable costs. Right? That's the appeal of it. Now, what's the flaw?
So in just social related, so then in those industries where there is no demand uncertainty, it's a flat kind of
What industry is that?
So let's
The
say
only one is in heaven, where there is certainty that all of us are going to, unless you are accounting for hell as well.
So let's take for example pharmaceutical or hospital industries where you anyway have demand. It is not dependent upon what climate of economy is there. So you'll always have a need for medicines. You'll always have a need.
Of course not. When the economy is having hard times, there is more crime, more shootings, and therefore greater use of hospital facilities. Well documented. You didn't learn that in strategy. Okay. What is interesting here is our tendency as humans, and this has been well documented in psychology, is that we tend to weigh the downside a whole lot more than the upside. So our decisions are skewed more heavily by the possibility of making losses, much more so. And that has been documented in a variety of different functional areas as well. And you're doing the same thing. You are responding to what would happen if the demand were to be too low. Right? But what if the demand is much higher than expected? If there is greater uncertainty and which one means a higher uncertainty to you? Well, in both cases, variance increases, but which one, is what we associated with higher demand, where the demand curve spreads out into that broken line, in both directions, or only in the downward direction. Well, clearly, you are trained to think that uncertainty is the top graph, not the bottom graph. But the human mind tends to think of it more like the lower graph, emphasizing and looking at what would happen if the spread is only on the downside. Now, correctly speaking, you should be thinking of the uncertainty as in the top graph, which means that while there may be a higher likelihood in the broken curve, that there will be greater chance of some really large losses or low demand, but there is also greater chance of really high demand. And you ignore that completely. And if the demand is high, what would you want to have?
Spare capacity.
You want to have spare capacity to take care of that demand. And if you run out of capacity, what can you do?
You lose the opportunity.
Yeah, so that's a worse situation. You may try to, outsource that production completely, but otherwise you're going to lose or run overtime, extra time, or extra shifts. But those are all very costly. Right? The cost is much higher. And the worst situation is if you lose that customer. And when you lose that customer, that's the biggest loss, because it's much cheaper to keep a customer than to gain him back later. Worse, you have sent him to your competitor, which makes it easier for your competitor to gain. So in a sense, the intuition is obvious that the cost of a mistake on the upper end of the demand curve is much greater. And so, if anything, what should you weigh more? The spread on the upper side. And so, as you said, if the uncertainty is greater, you want more capacity, more spare capacity to take care of that demand. And again, that's actually, it turns out, so we did an empirical analysis, starting with the same usual assumption in our management accounting textbooks, that or the basic intuition, and much as we analyzed the data, we found this same phenomena, that greater the uncertainty, greater are the fixed costs. How can that be? And so we looked at the data with many different models, the different slicing of the samples. The phenomena is amazingly robust, that greater the uncertainty, the higher is the fixed cost. And so why would that be? It's again the simple trade-off between the cost of too little capacity being much greater than the cost of slack capacity. Okay? So once again, it got the best research award, but for a reason. Be willing to challenge very deeply embedded assumptions, and that's all they are until there is empirical evidence to back it up. So we had to retrofit this to come up with this the theory, if you may, since the empirical analysis was so strong, and the way we had to write up the paper is in the classic way, where the theory comes first and then the empirical evidence, but in reality it isn't so clean. It in fact was in the other direction. And that is what I urge you to do as well. I mean, that is be open to new ideas. So, what? Yeah.
So, which is this paper? Could you please share?
It's in the Accounting Review 2014. Oh yeah, you are the accountant. In the DEA conferences, they think they are insulting me by calling me, you are the accountant. The hidden meaning being, how can I know anything about economics or on? But I don't need to answer them. I just say I get paid twice as much. So what we are talking about is new branch that we've developed in cost management. How much time do you have?
Another 15 minutes.
Is the idea that costs don't arise automatically, or costs result from decisions that managers have to make, and managers, being rational or irrational, are affected by information and incentives that they have. And so by observing these decisions, you can infer that what the managers might be thinking, and that inference can be very valuable in projecting the future for the company that goes beyond just the hard numbers. Right? And again, it's a simple but very powerful idea. Yes?
So, are you saying that managers are risk neutral? Because
No. In fact, we've studied that as well, which is that does the risk aversion of managers affect the degree of sticky costs? But it doesn't involve me. Some other people who have picked up on this idea. And
earlier it seemed like that if they are following this, then they are basically acting as this neutral person.
No. That's just possibilities to convey the idea. But not at all. And that's an interesting thing to do. There are some people studying gender. Do women respond differently than men? There is some evidence, guys, that suggests that women perform much better under competitive pressure than men do. So how would that affect the cost behavior? Very interesting questions that open up as a result. Yeah.
So I guess
By the way, sorry, let me hold you. As I said, I developed this measure of strategy. And one thing that we can document is differentiators have much more sticky costs. Why? Because for pursuing a differentiation strategy, you're going to have to invest in R&D or in marketing and advertising or in training your human capital, and all those are long-term projects. And you can't just cut it back simply because sales go down. And therefore, it makes sense for the managers in those companies to continue to maintain those expenditure, those costs, even when sales go down, because that's the long-term strategy. And strategy, again, my definition is long-term. Yeah. No, you forgot your question. That's good. Oh, sorry.
So just one concern. So now the effort is like, as you said, that consultancies want to variabilize everything. So variabilization.
No, firms want to. They're paying the consultants. If they don't pay, consultants go nowhere.
So in times of uncertainty, like of course, variabilization helps when it goes down. That's why we agree that we look down, go down. But so why wouldn't it even help when it's going upwards? Because like outsourcing, etc., can be done more when the time is.
Does it remain the same price?
Okay, so prices increase.
Prices go. When everything becomes very tight, everybody is constrained. And all the companies that are doing the outsourcers, sourcing, they can see the market. And that's one way. And if, as I said, that's only one way. The other is you run an extra shift or you run extra time, more cost. Everything becomes more cost. You learn that. Oh, the economists have come. But in macroeconomics, right? I mean, what happens in the cycles? When the demand is all going up while the cycle is on the upward, but then it reaches a stage when all these economic resources are constrained, and as a result, the prices go up. That's what you teach that.
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's my validation. But it's interesting. So I also am studying. It's a great opportunity I got into. Is in Calgary, which is the headquarters of petroleum, oil and gas industry in Canada. So there are a lot of new oil that's been discovered there, using new methods like oil sands, and they've learned to develop the technology to extract that. But they have the highest marginal costs in the industry, some of the highest costs. And so they are very sensitive to shifts in the oil prices. But that got me started by talking to the CEOs and COOs and CFOs of those companies, which is what's a great advantage of me working in Calgary with my colleagues there. And so think about it. When should you invest in acquiring a new property that might have oil or gas?
During a recession.
During a recession, why?
Cheaper. Asset prices are falling.
But then why doesn't everybody do that?
They're worried about the downside. Not they, as much as the financiers, the banks, or equity investments. So even though you would prefer to buy low, not everybody can do that because they don't have the financial resources to do so. So who's able to do so? Those that have put things aside during the upturn and built up their financial strength, planning to invest during the downturn. It's very interesting, and it's a complete cyclical strategy. But it goes contrary to what we, as I was telling you, like the BCG matrix in strategy, that cost may be, you have the stars where you invest while there is growth potential, and you divest or you stop investing in the cows and the dogs. But this is the best thing I learned at Harvard Business School in my doctoral program is that CEOs are CEOs because they cannot count beyond 2. So if you want to communicate with CEOs, you've got to be able to express your ideas in a simple 2x2 matrix. So it doesn't matter how complex it might really be, you will not be a good academic consultant unless you can translate it into a simple 2x2 matrix. Actually, that works well in the MBA class as well. They don't expect an economist to be that simple. So, but there is a beauty to it. You learn to simplify your ideas, so that it can be seen at a glance as to what exactly it is. But I've purposely been kind of giving you tips. I do that in schools all around the world because you are the future as far as academics is concerned. Alright. So what we're talking about in sticky cost behavior is that the change, right? So if you have a fixed and variable cost model, take a difference version of it. The difference version would be a straight line going through the origin and the dotted line, which is the broken line, sorry,
right? The same straight line, because the slope of that line will not change. What we are arguing, this is in my, I think 2004, no, not 14, this is actually 2003. This is in Journal of Accounting Research. This is the one that was accepted by the referee in one sentence. I wish I had done this paper myself. But it took a long time for it to really catch on and get established, because it gets so fundamentally contrary to the usual line of thinking. And what we're finding is, in fact, this is a sticky behavior. On average, costs don't go down as much when sales go down. That's only on average. And the fascinating part is that this is also a contingency theory. When the managers are optimistic, what will happen? That's sticky behavior. But what if they are pessimistic? Then it will be the other way, the green line. Right? That's what happens. And empirically that is true as well. And the nice part, the beauty of it, is that we can articulate some of these signals that correspond to managers being optimistic and or managers being pessimistic. That's in the sense of, again, validation. Does it make intuitive sense? But even beyond that, there is information content, because what we correlated it, optimism and pessimism, is publicly available information. But what we can infer from the actual decision of the managers is the superior information that they have about their own business. Right? Yeah.
So there will, I imagine, an information asymmetry between even the managers of the same industry. For example, regarding how their optimism and pessimism regarding, say, future market conditions apply.
Yeah.
So in those conditions, will, say, for example, an analysis of the textual kind of reports that they provide, will there be differentiation even within the same
That's an interesting question. If you don't do this quickly, I'll ask one of my PhD students to do it. If you want to do it, just drop me a line. But that's a very good question. It has not been looked at. That is conflicting evidence from different firms in the same industry. And then how can you resolve it?
So then, but then you also mentioned that we should have the data and then we should start looking for the question.
No, I didn't mean that in that rigid a fashion. Absolutely not.
Because in that case, he is proposing a good question about the conflicting evidence in this. Suppose
So
we do not
let
have the
me
data
explain
for-
this better. I knew I wanted to study cost behavior, right? And for the other study that I presented, which is a different study entirely, I got some special data from the US Census of plants. So it was very good data at the plant level, which you don't normally get. And because of the results there were so surprising, my co-author who did all the empirical work, I asked him to check CompuStat, which is at the firm level, and the same patterns held up at the firm level as well. But the reason that I did that study was because we had this unique data set. But the cost behavior was just a fundamental question that that people have used the CompuStat to estimate cost functions. There are so many research studies, so many textbooks. There are studies in strategy that have looked at it, fitting it just, and even in economics. In AER, there are a couple of papers that have used that simple fixed and variable cost models. And it just trying to get that evidence. And this is a relatively simple model that can be done with the data.
I could not have looked at the cyclicality unless I had the data from the oil and gas industry. So that's the kind of a balance that, and I can't answer everything about why they're doing what they're doing with the data that I have. So you do want to start with a broad question that you have in mind, so as to channel your search for the data. But then, once you get the data, refine that broad question into testable questions that you motivate your people with. Right? So there's a subtle but very important distinction. Okay. So this is all done initially. We did it with the North American data in CompuStat. It has since been replicated in virtually all countries, and virtually all countries actually exhibit this behavior as well. And that's really been very rewarding to see that an idea that you introduce is in fact people are replicating it and it holds all over the world. All right, I do want to take just a couple of minutes. You can make these available. I said, I will tell you a little bit about the financial side as well. It's okay if you make these available to people who are interested. Except don't use those animations. I'm just kidding. So things like the predictability of earnings, how revenue and costs match with one another, the conservativeness of earnings. A lot of these are actually explainable in terms of these issues of cost management. The idea on conservativeness was that accountants tend to be more conservative. They recognize losses before they recognize profits. And what we find is a lot of it is explained in terms of stickiness, and which, as I told you, is also related to the firm's strategy. And all these are connected phenomena which happen to be true. Well, I don't have time to go searching for this in a minute, so let me just quickly mention this. So the most important study that we have in this area for accounting at the moment is how do the analysts and investors respond to it. As I said, very, very quickly, they don't do that adequately. So the prices are distorted, and that is why we can construct a portfolio investing in those firms that exhibit greater stickiness, because they in fact are more confident about the future. It's the inference that you can draw. And over holding that portfolio for a 2-year period, you make huge returns compared to the normal returns that you get. What is also interesting is what I observed earlier, that you get drip by drip by drip. It's called the drift effect. And it's been documented, for instance, in how the markets respond to earnings announcements, and that they don't get captured immediately, and they show that there's a drift. This drift is many times the size of the earnings announcement drift. It goes beyond the earnings announcement drift, and in fact, part of the earnings announcement drift is explained by the sticky cost drift, and it lasts for 8 quarters. What does a drift mean? It means, and this is what I want to end with, I'm not saying that the markets are not efficient, not at all. No, the market has 2 conflicting hypotheses. The one that accountants here mentioned, namely a higher expense to sales ratio, is bad news. It's inefficiency, as in fundamental analysis. On the other hand, under certain conditions in our theory, it is good news, revealing the knowledge of the managers about their future. How does an analyst figure that out? Which is which? So the way we are theorizing here is that it takes time. And so every quarter that follows, they look at the quarterly earnings announcements. And if the quarterly earnings announcement that follows is good news, then in a Bayesian sense, you put more emphasis on my theory and less on the fundamental analysis. And conversely as well. And that is exactly what we find, that quarter after quarter after quarter, the confidence in our theory, my theory, increases. And that's why we see the drift. But once again, what I want to point out is there are interesting possibilities out there staring you in the eye if only you are willing to look for it. Right? The classic example of penicillin, right? This was something that they were trying to develop bacterial cultures in order to test some new medicine. And they found that a few of the petri dishes, no culture developed. So most people would just take that as a disaster and throw it out. But that's what you want to do. When there is evidence that is contrary to your expectation, don't throw it out and explore it further. Because our entire work about the demand uncertainty would not have gone anywhere if we had simply thrown that out instead of looking for an explanation for what is really happening. So keep that in mind. The rest will be very well over the years, and I'm sure it will help you also. Thanks.
So thank you, Professor Banker. I think we had a glimpse of what we know Rajiv Banker is all about. So thank you again on behalf of IIMA. Today, sincerely thank you for spending some time with us. We look forward to having you again. Thank you.